The city pulsed with life as the sun dipped below the horizon. Neon signs flickered to life, casting a kaleidoscope of colors onto crowded streets. The hum of car engines mixed with the calls of street vendors, each competing for attention in the endless symphony of urban chaos. Beneath the towering skyscrapers and the buzz of human activity, unnoticed by most, a small tabby cat moved with quiet purpose. Whiskers, as he was known to the few who had observed him long enough to give him a name, was no ordinary stray. His sleek frame and gleaming green eyes suggested a wisdom far beyond his years. A creature of the streets, hardened yet tender, unseen yet indispensable. As the last rays of sunlight faded, the city's shadows stretched and intertwined, creating a canvas of light and dark. Whiskers paused on a cracked pavement, his ears twitching at the cacophony around him. There was no hesitation in his movements, no uncertainty in his gaze. He navigated the labyrinth of alleys and bustling thoroughfares with an air of confidence, a shadow among shadows. To some, he was merely a cat, one of many strays eking out an existence in a world of towering giants. But Whiskers had long since mastered the streets, learned their rhythms, their secrets. Tonight, however, the rhythm felt different, a subtle shift in the air, a quiet urgency that only he seemed to sense. The city breathed its usual melody of clamor and movement, but Whiskers caught a whisper beneath it, a thread of meaning waiting to be unraveled. He turned his head toward the glow of the market square in the distance. The faint echo of laughter mingled with the sharp clang of metal shutters being drawn down for the night. Something awaited him there. He could feel it, like a vibration in his very core. As Whiskers padded forward, his movements were fluid, deliberate, like a dancer stepping to a rhythm only he could hear. The city, with all its noise and chaos, seemed to part before him, allowing him passage. And though no one noticed him, his presence was undeniable, a quiet force moving through the crowd. The path ahead was uncertain, but Whiskers had long learned to trust his instincts. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it.
In the heart of the city's market square, beneath a canopy of flickering lights, Lila stood frozen. Her tiny hands clutched a worn teddy bear, its fur matted from years of love. The chatter of merchants and the laughter of passers-by filled the air, but to her, the world had fallen silent. She spun in place, her eyes wide and searching, her breaths quick and shallow. Her parents were nowhere to be seen. Moments ago, she had been mesmerized by a colorful display of spinning tops at a vendor's stall. One glance away, one step too far, and now she was alone, adrift in a sea of unfamiliar faces. The crowd surged around her, a living tide of motion and noise. People brushed past, too engrossed in their own lives to notice the small figure standing still against the current. Lila's chest tightened, and tears blurred her vision. She hugged her teddy bear closer, as though its threadbare body could shield her from the overwhelming chaos. Panic swirled in her mind, each thought sharper than the last. Had her parents left without her? Would she ever find them again? She tried calling out, her voice thin and trembling. Mom? Dad? But the words were swallowed by the clamor of the market. No one stopped. No one looked. Lila felt the first tear roll down her cheek, warm and heavy, as despair began to creep into her heart. The lights that had seemed so magical moments ago now glared down at her, harsh and unfeeling. The laughter around her felt cruel, a mocking reminder of the safety she no longer felt. And then, as if summoned by her silent plea, he appeared. A flash of gray and white fur caught her eye. She blinked, focusing through her tears, and saw him, Whiskers. The cat sat a few feet away, his green eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed almost human. His tail swayed lazily behind him, a soft rhythm that contrasted with the chaos around them. Lila sniffled and wiped her face with the back of her hand, staring at the cat. He didn't move, didn't look away. There was something comforting in his gaze, something that stilled the storm inside her, if only for a moment. Slowly, tentatively, she knelt and extended a hand. Whiskers approached her with a graceful calm, his movements unhurried, his eyes never leaving hers. When his nose brushed her fingers, a small smile broke through her fear. For the first time since she had realized she was alone, Lila felt a spark of hope. She didn't understand why this stray cat had chosen her, or why his presence felt so reassuring. All she knew was that she wasn't entirely alone anymore, and in a world as big and intimidating as this one, Even a small companion could make all the difference. Whiskers sat calmly beside her, his fur soft against the cool pavement. Lila's small hand rested gently on his back, her trembling fingers finding comfort in his presence. The world around them seemed to blur, the sounds of the market fading into the background as if they existed in their own little bubble of stillness. Lila's heart rate slowed, and her breaths became steadier. She had no idea why this cat had appeared at the moment she needed him most, but somehow, his quiet companionship gave her a sense of peace. Whiskers turned his head slightly, his green eyes gleaming in the dimming light, as if beckoning her to follow. He stood and stretched, his limbs taut with the same unhurried grace that had drawn her to him in the first place. Without a sound, he began to move, stepping lightly in the direction of the alleyway that led away from the busy square. Lila, feeling a spark of curiosity and something else, an odd sense of trust, stood and followed him. The cat's silent, confident stride guided her, his movements sure as if he knew exactly where he was going. As they moved through the narrow alley, the noise of the market grew fainter, replaced by the soft patter of Whiskers' paws on the pavement and the occasional rustle of wind through the trash bins. The path ahead was dim, but Lila was no longer afraid. Whiskers had made her feel safer in a world that had felt overwhelming just moments ago. She looked down at him, her hand still clasping her teddy bear. It was then that she realized she had been so focused on finding her parents that she hadn't even thought about how she might get lost. But now, with Whiskers leading the way, she wasn't thinking about anything except the rhythm of her steps and the steady presence of the cat beside her. Whiskers paused at the mouth of the alley, his ears flicking as if listening for something. Lila stopped behind him, watching in wonder as he turned his head to meet her gaze. There was a certain calm in his eyes, an unspoken promise that everything would be okay. In that moment, Lila felt a strange but reassuring sense of purpose. Whatever happened, she knew she could trust Whiskers to guide her. With a soft flick of his tail, Whiskers resumed walking, and Lila followed. The quiet alley stretched before them, a simple path that held an unspoken invitation. She didn't know where they were going, but for the first time that night, she didn't feel alone. She felt safe. With each step, Lila grew more certain. Whiskers moved ahead with an air of purpose, his tail swaying gently as he guided her through the quiet, unfamiliar streets. The path they walked was no longer filled with fear. Instead, it was quiet, almost peaceful. The world seemed to shift around them, the sounds of the city growing distant, as if it respected the bond forming between the girl and the stray cat. She marveled at how Whiskers seemed to know exactly where he was going. It wasn't a straight path, not at all. There were turns, narrow alleyways, and hidden corners where the faint glow of streetlights barely reached. Yet, through it all, Whiskers led her without faltering. It was as though he had walked this route 100 times before. At times, Lila had to hurry to keep up, her little legs struggling to match his swift pace, but she never felt left behind. Every so often, Whiskers would pause, glancing over his shoulder, ensuring she was still there. His gaze was always steady, always reassuring. He wasn't just leading her, he was watching over her. Time seemed to stretch. Each minute felt longer, yet somehow comforting. The world around them, once overwhelming and vast, now felt smaller. The harsh lights of the market had been replaced by the softer glow of distant street lamps. The city was quiet here, as if it too recognized the importance of their journey. Lila's grip on her teddy bear loosened, her shoulders no longer tense with worry. Every time she stumbled, Whiskers would slow down, waiting patiently for her to catch up. He never rushed her, never seemed impatient. It was as though he understood that this journey, though brief, was just as important for her as it was for him. And with each step, Lila felt her fear melt away, replaced by a calm sense of purpose that she hadn't known before. As Lila followed Whiskers, the air grew cooler and the streets grew emptier. The bustling city that had once been so full of life now seemed to recede, leaving behind only the quiet hum of distant traffic and the soft rhythm of Whiskers' paws. But with the quiet came a rising tension. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading somewhere important, somewhere unknown. Her mind began to race, wondering what would come next. They turned down an even narrower alley, the walls pressing in on either side. The lights here were dimmer, the shadows deeper, and Lila felt the slightest chill creep up her spine. She glanced over her shoulder, her heartbeat quickening as the world seemed to close in around her. For a moment, the eerie quietness made her doubt, and she hesitated. But then she looked at Whiskers. He was still moving forward, unfazed by the silence, his eyes calm and steady. There was no fear in him, only a quiet confidence that gave Lila the courage to continue. With a deep breath, she quickened her pace to match his. Just as she thought they had reached the end of the alley, a loud bark echoed from the darkness ahead. Lila froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound of claws skittering on concrete followed, a dog, aggressive and out of sight but growing nearer. Whiskers stopped abruptly, his ears twitching. He glanced back at Lila, then turned to face the oncoming threat. His body tensed, every muscle prepared for what might come next. Lila stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. This was different. This wasn't the peaceful journey she had come to trust. This was a moment of danger. The sound of the dog's growl grew louder, echoing through the alley like a warning. Lila's pulse raced as the shadows ahead shifted, and the dog emerged, its teeth bared, eyes wild with aggression. It was larger than any dog Lila had seen before, a mix of fear and fury in its stance. She instinctively took a step back, clutching her teddy bear tighter. But Whiskers didn't retreat. He stepped forward, his body low to the ground, his fur bristling, eyes locked on the dog with a quiet intensity. Lila watched in awe as the cat faced the much larger creature without a hint of hesitation. The dog barked once, its body shaking with every growl, but Whiskers remained still, his gaze unwavering. For a long moment, the alley was frozen in time. The dog and the cat stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Lila could feel the tension in the air, the danger hanging just inches from them. It was a standoff, a test of strength and resolve. Then, without warning, Whiskers lunged, his movements swift and precise. The dog recoiled, momentarily stunned by the cat's sudden aggression. Whiskers wasn't just defending himself, he was protecting her. The dog, now startled by Whiskers' bold move, hesitated. It barked once more, but the fierce intensity in Whiskers' eyes seemed to cut through the noise. With another swift movement, the cat swiped at the dog, sending it stumbling back, its ears flattened in submission. The dog's aggression turned to fear as it skittered backward, its growls fading into the distance as it retreated into the shadows. Lila stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had expected the worst. Yet, in the blink of an eye, Whiskers had changed the course of the encounter. The stray cat, so small in comparison, had stood his ground against a much larger foe, driving it away with nothing but courage and determination. Whiskers turned to her then, his eyes softening as if to assure her that the danger had passed. His body relaxed, and the tension in the air dissolved as quickly as it had arrived. Without another word, Whiskers continued down the alley, his pace calm and steady once more. Lila, still in shock, followed him, her legs slightly unsteady but filled with a newfound sense of awe. What had just happened? How had this cat known exactly what to do? She glanced at Whiskers, who, without missing a beat, led her onward. The danger was behind them, but the journey wasn't over. There was still something waiting ahead, something they had yet to face. As they continued down the alley, the cool air settled around them, and the city noises seemed even further away. Lila's heart was still racing, but now it beat with a quiet reverence for the cat beside her. Whiskers had protected her, not with force or fury, but with a calm confidence that spoke volumes. She glanced at him as they walked. There was no grand gesture, no heroic stance. He was simply a cat, small, quiet, unassuming, but in that moment, he was everything she needed. The bravery he had shown had been born from a place of understanding, of knowing exactly when to act. Lila couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for this small creature who had chosen her, guided her, and protected her without a second thought. They rounded another corner, and the air seemed to change again. The feeling of unease that had followed them from the market began to ebb, replaced by something warmer, something hopeful. The alley opened into a small courtyard, bathed in the soft glow of a street lamp. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lila felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps the world wasn't as overwhelming as it seemed. Whiskers, with all his quiet strength, had reminded her that even in the darkest moments, there could be light. Whiskers stopped at the center of the courtyard, his body alert as he scanned the area. Lila stood beside him, her eyes wide with curiosity. The courtyard was small but serene, a peaceful contrast to the noisy, chaotic streets they had left behind. But there was something here, something waiting. She could feel it in the air. As if on cue, a faint sound reached their ears, a soft rustling, almost imperceptible. Lila's heart skipped a beat, and her eyes darted around the courtyard. The noise came from the corner, where a small bush swayed gently. Whiskers stood motionless, staring at the spot, his tail flicking once. Lila took a cautious step forward, her hand still holding tightly to her teddy bear. The rustling grew louder, and then from behind the bush emerged another figure. A woman, wrapped in a long coat, her face partially hidden by the hood she wore. She moved toward Lila, her steps slow but purposeful. "Are you lost, little one?" she asked, her voice gentle, though it carried a quiet strength. Lila hesitated, then nodded. Before she could speak, the woman's gaze turned to Whiskers. "This little one has been keeping an eye on you," she said with a soft smile. Lila looked down at Whiskers, who was still watching the woman with a calm expression. Somehow, in a way she couldn't yet explain, Lila knew everything was about to change. The woman knelt down to Lila's level, her eyes kind and understanding. "You don't have to be scared anymore," she said softly, her voice a comfort that wrapped around Lila like a warm blanket. "I know where your parents are." Lila's eyes widened, disbelief washing over her face. You do?" The woman nodded, her smile growing. "I've been looking for you, actually. Your parents are worried sick, but they're not far from here." She stood up and extended her hand toward Lila. "Come on, let's get you back to them." As the woman took Lila's hand, the weight in Lila's chest lightened. For the first time that night, she felt a deep sense of relief. The tension that had gripped her since the moment she'd lost sight of her parents seemed to dissolve completely. And as they started to walk toward the exit of the courtyard, Lila glanced back at Whiskers, who was following them silently. "Thank you," Lila whispered, her voice barely above a breath. She wasn't sure if the cat could understand her, but somehow she knew he knew. He had led her here, protected her, and kept her safe when she needed it most. The bond between them was unspoken but undeniable. As they emerged from the alley, Lila saw her parents waiting at the end of the street, their faces filled with relief. Without hesitation, she ran toward them, her heart soaring as she reunited with the people she loved. And as she glanced back one last time, Whiskers stood watching from the shadows, his green eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. The journey was over, but the memory of this night would stay with Lila forever, the night a small cat had been her hero.